Hi, Amal. Yes, we are on and we're starting in 1 minute.
Hey, Leila.
Yes.
You're going to explain translation?
Yes.
Probably better you do than I do.
Okay. And I think it's 1:03 London time. We're going to start. Welcome everybody. أهلا وسهلا بالجميع وشكرا لحضوركم.
Welcome everybody and thank you for joining us.
On feminist political economy in the MENA region. My name is Leila Al-Audat and I'm the MENA director at the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. I'll start with some housekeeping rules just so we are sure that anyone who needs interpretation has the technical assistance as early on as possible. So my colleague Nihad, thanks Nihad. So this webinar will be streamed live on Facebook. You'll be able to see speakers but not participants on the screen. It'll also be recorded and it'll be available on YouTube after you receive the link. If you have registered, you can also find both on our Facebook pages. If you have any questions or comments for our speakers, please use the Q&A button on Zoom. And we'll be able to collect all of these and ask them. If you have a question for a particular speaker, please let us know in your comment. If you have any technical questions, my colleague Nihad will be able to answer them. You can use the chat function. If you'd like to tweet, please use FPE_MENA hashtag. This event is interpreted between English and Arabic, and you can use the interpretation button, the interpretation function. طبعا في ترجمة من العربي للإنجليزي من الإنجليزي للعربي.
So interpretation into both languages is available, Arabic and English. You can access it by using the interpretation button shaped like a globe. And you would just need to mute the original sound in order to listen to the interpreter only.
So you don't end up hearing both languages at the same time. For any technical assistance, we're available on the chat to answer your questions. And last but not least, I'd like to stress that this is a safe space. If at any point you encountered any issues, please write to us on mena@wilf.org or to any of our personal emails. Thank you so much. That's all our housekeeping. And I'm going to move to our speakers. So why are we holding this webinar? It's been a great opportunity for us to work with our speakers and to produce this webinar on feminist political economy in the MENA region. We're trying to tackle where capitalist policies fail and what are the feminist alternatives for them. This webinar is the first in a series of other online engagements on the topic and is meant to be an informative and engaging space. Hence, the objective is to provide you with a global and contextual, as well as MENA-focused picture on the overall analytical frameworks of feminist political economy, as well as contextualized issues and areas of focus. We're hoping that these tools will be helpful for those working on the MENA region to assess the challenges and design effective plans on how to address the root causes from an intersectional feminist perspective, like most things we do at WILPF. We're delighted to be joined today by Dr. Rima Majid, who is an assistant professor of sociology at the American University of Beirut. Her research focus on the fields of social inequality, social movement, identity politics, sectarianism, conflict, and violence. She'll focus on the root causes of the dire economic conditions in the MENA region and the need of a feminist political economy approach in the region. Welcome, Rima, and thank you for joining us. It's also a great pleasure to welcome Rasha Abed, who directs the Economic Development and Post-War Recovery Program at the Peace Track Initiative. We work very closely with Peace Track Initiative, our partners in Yemen, and they have been doing a fantastic work on these issues. Rasha is also a visiting fellow at the LSE Women, Peace and Security Center, and her research focuses on promoting gender-based analysis of post-conflict Yemen and empowering women in rural and agricultural communities through education and market access. Rasha will take us through the Yemeni context and specifically on the community level, women contribution to economy and gender dynamics and economy. And last but not least, it's great to bring the knowledge of my colleague, Nela Probek, who leads WILPF's work on developing feminist alternatives to current political economy in conflict and post-conflict countries. Nela is a feminist activist from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in addition to her work on feminist political economy, she coordinates WILPF's work in Bosnia and Herzegovina. She's the author of WILPF's Feminist Political Economy Guide, on which a lot of this is based, and she'll take us through general conceptual frameworks of the feminist political economy and present the main challenges as well as the need of such an approach in the context of conflict and post-conflict societies and countries. So without further ado, over to Madeleine, our Secretary General, to take us through her opening remarks. Over to you, Madeleine.
Well, thanks, Lola, and thanks everyone for coming. There's 71 participants, I noticed, which is fabulous for a snowy morning in New York, and I don't know what it's doing wherever you are. I'm going to be super short because you've got some brilliant people in the panel, so you really want to hear from people who know what they're talking about when it comes to political economy, because I am a super late attendee to the doctrine of political economy, if you can call it a doctrine. It was Yakin Ertuk who first brought it to my attention in one of her reports, her last report to the Human Rights Council, when she was the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. I don't know whether you recall that, but I do recall when I heard that she was going to do that. I think, what? When there's so many other important things to be doing, you know, said she, the lawyer, not understanding the alchemy that you can have when you have law and sociology come together to better understand how the world works. And it was Jackie True who supported her in that and then went on to trailblaze. And her book, The Political Economy of Violence Against Women, is one of those books which was seminal in changing my thinking in terms of what we really have to do to address the issues of violence, and how from the micro we can step back to the macro and understand much more an intersectional, three-dimensional way of thinking, how we have to unpack the structures which lead to the support of a patriarchal system which inhibits our abilities to have a more peaceful world. So I think it's particularly pertinent in the case of MENA. We have worked on it and applied it in Ukraine to some effect. We've done it in Cameroon to some effect. And it is, for me, I think, a brilliant way of understanding how the world is working and what we need to do. So over to those who can explain better than I how we can actually make this happen. So really looking forward to hearing from you all. Thank you. Enjoy.
Thank you so much, Madeleine. I'm going to go to our speakers and try to understand from them, why is a feminist political economy important and what difference would it make in our region? In our joint feminist effort to understand and address the root causes of conflict and its impact, and to find and develop ways for prevention and recovery, it's crucial to explore and address the linkage between political, economic, and social factors, and to understand the central role of economy within the political and peace processes and its differential impact on the lives of women and men and the prospect of feminist peace. Nela, I want to start with a question to you. What is a feminist political economy and why is it needed to inform feminist peace? You're muted, sorry.
Always make the same. Yes, well, I just wanted to say hello to everybody that is joining us. It's really a pleasure to see the interest, and hello to Laila and the rest of the panelists. Thank you so much for, first of all, for bringing me on board to this conversation. I'm really happy to take part of it, and I hope you all are doing well considering the circumstances. So, you know, as the title of this webinar suggests, the current mainstream political economy is capitalist and very much neoliberal, and it creates injustices and inequalities in our countries. and is really one of the key obstacles for peace, both in terms of building peace, but also in terms of maintaining it. Negotiating peace and working towards war and conflict-free societies is about what kind of societies we want to live in. How do we see public space and resources distributed and utilized? What do we want to center our societies around? What role do we foresee for each other? And how do we interact with each other, et cetera, et cetera. So for feminists, it's usually equality, justice, solidarity, and care we see as central to our societies, to our peace. And recently, I think a lot of feminists have increasingly started adding sustainability of our environment and planet as also one of the key points. So for us, it's obvious that without a proper critique of the mainstream political economy and a proper feminist alternative or alternatives to it, there is no sustainable transformation from war to peace. The economy and how we organize it flows out from the idea of what kind of society we want to live in. Hence, it's really not a separate conversation from the conversation of what sort of peace we want to see happen. So for WILPF and other progressive feminists, economic development in a conflict or post-conflict country is not a matter of expertise, but very much a matter of lived and highly gendered experiences of war and conflict. So when we're doing a feminist political economy analysis, we are putting politics and the economy together. And this, may sound really logical because it is, but economic decision-making and everything else that happens in the society, socially and politically, for some reason, tend to be analyzed as separate processes and structures. And this is in particular, I think, noticeable when we look at the peace processes. The political economy is often not discussed in formal peace talks, at least not in a transparent way and in the spaces that are available for us. But as it turns out, those discussions do actually take place. They just don't take place with us. They take place in spaces that are often reserved for experts and for those with military power or access to resources behind them. So for example, if we look at Syria, the World Bank has already been preparing all along for the post-conflict period. They maintain regular dialogues with what they call international community. I just don't know if they maintain regular dialogues with the Syrian people, those it will be most affected. They've done a report and damage assessment. They've done an economic and social impact analysis. They've done a social and economic analysis of displacement. So they've done research, and that might actually not sound that problematic because it's good that they are preparing, right? But the World Bank policies are not ideologically neutral. And if we look at their strategy for fragility, conflict, and violence, which is what they call it, we can see that there is a very clear neoliberal political economy at the basis of this approach. So, how they prepare is also important, not just that they prepare. So we want those conversations to take place in the open, because how we envision the political economy can be very much different from how they envision it. We envision a peace, built on core values of feminism, again, equality, justice, solidarity, care. That's our interest. That's where we are coming from. The World Bank, the IMF, and other international financial institutions, the domestic elites in our countries, and those that are currently driving conflict in our countries, their interest is somewhere else. So how does then feminist political economy analysis help us surface, first of all, our gendered experiences of conflict and wars, and then our interests in how the transition to peace should look like? So feminist political economy analysis very consciously looks at how economic policies that have been influenced by various actors affect the everyday lives of people, bringing together macro and the micro level, going all the way down to the level of communities and households, the families. And for feminists, the micro level is hugely important, because this is where our lives are shaped. This is where our lives happen. So classical political economy focuses on macroeconomic indicators such as gross domestic product or export-import ratio. But looking at those tells, I think, very little about, people and their ability to lead decent lives or to recover from war. So, for example, export-import ratio will not tell me anything about the salary levels or gender wage gap in, let's say, a Bosnian export industry, or it would tell me very little, basically nothing, of how a growing arms industry in Bosnia affects the lives of Afghani women, because Bosnia exports a lot of weapons to Afghanistan, it turns out. But probably, export-import ratios look really good on paper. but tells us nothing. So there are a couple of things that as feminists, we use as key analytical tools when we do our feminist political economy analysis. First, as feminists, we know that nothing happens in a gender neutral way, which is why gender is one of key analytical tools for us. We look at how gender determines our social relationships, and from then we identify the different economic effects that flow from that. And in conflict context, we add to that, I think, analysis, the gendered experiences of war and how those are affected by the economic and political decision making. You know, waging war is really still understood as a male endeavor. So surprise, surprise, most of the post-conflict recovery and reconstruction initiatives benefit more men than they benefit women. So we try to understand all of that. Another key analytical tool is looking at power structures and systems, you know, looking at how power who has the power within the community, within the country, within a family, how they got it, how they maintain it, and at what cost for the rest of us, and how does gender and race and class, etc., play into all of that. We take a closer look at wealth and power and resources and distribution, and we try to understand why, by whom, and for whom decisions are taken, who benefits, who loses, and what are the full consequences for such decisions and policies. And we can look, you know, in conflict settings, we can look how the experiences of war negatively affect women's and men's ability to access decent work, or what does access to things such as property, water, land mean in recovering from conflict. We can also shed light on ratio of spending between militarization and realization of socioeconomic rights. And finally, I'm also running out of time, so one final point. A third key tool is looking at the gender division of labor in both the formal economy, the paid one, and the reproductive and what's also called informal economy, which usually takes place in the private sphere of the household or in the communities, and is often invisible and unpaid, sometimes also paid. You know, whereas traditional economics looks at these two spheres as separate, feminist political economy focuses on the interconnection between the formal and informal economy, the productive and reproductive, the private and the public. And here we know that the conflict context brings with it specificities that need to be understood. You know, some things that used to be part of the private sphere have gone into public and vice versa. Women's position in society tend to shift back and forth depending on the society's need and so forth. So all of this needs to be understood in order to properly inform the transformation from conflict to peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nella. It's fascinating actually how what comes across as basic common sense in feminist spaces is things we need to highlight and almost introduce into conflict analysis. We've had the exact same experience when we're speaking about justice and transitional justice in the context we work on. When 7 or 8 years after a conflict starts, you find small feminist organizations and feminist activists saying, up until now, you haven't once identified the gendered harm, and what's the harms experienced by women is entirely missing in many years of studying transitional justice. So they are doing this work just as much as the work on feminist political economy. And I'm going to move to Rima. And Rima, you've recently written an excellent blog for WILPF on the needs for feminist political economy analysis in the MENA context. Why did you find this particularly needed in the region, and how? And what value would it add to the struggle for feminist peace?
Great, thank you so much, Leila, and thank you everyone for being here. So, I mean, building on what Nella said, then, you know, thinking about this blog and you know, when I was writing it, the first thing that really pushed me to start thinking about this and write this blog was we've lived through decades of a systematic effort to alienate the discussions around the economy from our everyday life. Right, with the technopolitics around us, especially in the region, but this is more global to capitalism. Discussions about the economy, about what happened, are always perceived or have been, or we've been told, are too complex for us, and they are the domain of the experts, right? And I mean, what we're calling for and calling for a feminist political economy approach is really to bring back that discussion in our activism as feminists and as people who care for a more just word. And to simplify it, because this is really not nuclear science, what happens in the economy clearly has implications on our everyday lives. And this was very obvious in the past year. It was an exceptional year, but I think everywhere, and specifically in the MENA region, it became very clear that women were really at the forefront. And I don't say this as a cliche. I'm not saying this as the revolution is women, but I also say this to say that it was clear that the role of women, but also the implications of these political, economic, and social crises in the region had huge impact on women's lives, and therefore pushed them to be at the forefront of the uprisings that we've seen since 2019, 18, 19 in the region, but also before with the first wave, and also at the forefront of the care labor that was so crucial for our societies to stay afloat during the pandemic and what developed after that. So we suddenly discovered that the category that has become called the essential workers, most of them are actually women. It's actually care right? It's cleaners, it's nurses, it's midwives, it's people who've done labor that is so crucial to our societies, but that for a very long time has either been labor with very low pay or labor with no pay. So reproductive labor. So from that, going from these 2 points, I think it's very essential, and I think it's already happening. There are feminist groups in the region that are thinking in that direction, but we need more of this. We need more feminist political economy analysis of what is happening in the region. How does it impact the lives of women? Because this has a huge implication. So why do I say, a feminist political economy is important everywhere on this planet, but why do I think it's particularly important in the MENA region? Well, for 2 main reasons. First is that this is the region of the world that has the highest, that is the most unstable politically, so very high rates of conflict and violence. And second, because this is the region of the world that has the highest rates of economic inequalities and youth unemployment in the world. Therefore, and of course, the very alarming economic figures and the very alarming conflict figures are clearly linked together. So, so it becomes, it becomes very logical, I think, to start to think about what does it mean for women, and what do the figures tell us? So, just looking very quickly at the latest reports on the region, we see that this is a region that has around 71% of its workers in the informal sector. That's huge. Of those 71%, we have 62% women. So clearly, when we start to look at this micro picture, we see that the implications on women's lives are huge. But below this surface of these numbers, this has clear implications on the lives of women in the region and in their everyday life, right? We have seen, for example, in the latest crisis in Lebanon with the collapse of the banking sector and the financial sector, it was actually women who have paid the highest price, mainly because they are the more exploitable or disposable labor. They were the first to be kicked out of their jobs, or they are the ones who are mainly in the informal sector and therefore who can receive half a salary or no salary, or who can be asked to work more for less. But we have also seen this for example, in the case of foreign domestic workers in the country, who also in the past year have been mobilizing in Lebanon, other parts of the region as well. So these implications, we can either look at the macro numbers and we see why it's important, or we can just look around us in our neighborhoods and what's happening to around us, and we will see the same story. Why do we then need a feminist political economy approach? It's precisely to link the stories around us with those numbers we see in reports that are sometimes a bit complicated, but if we simplify it by linking those two levels, it becomes really easy and obvious that decisions that are made behind closed doors by mainly by men wearing suits, are having a huge implication on the lives of women in the region. Now, this is not new, and the roots of these inequalities and of these very alarming realities we are living in the region can be traced back to a history of colonization. And we see that a lot of the inequalities, or a lot of the dire realities that are lived by women in the region today date back to the colonial period, when, for example, we can think about the personal status law that is lacking. Many women in the region until today are still fighting to get the right to pass on their nationality to their kids. So this goes back to the legal framework that was put in place during the colonial period at the turn of the 20th century. But it goes even beyond that to also think about women's rights in terms of access to reproductive health. So, for example, laws around abortion in the region were also shaped at that period when colonial powers in the region were wanted to encourage a pronatalist approach, and therefore prevented or prohibited abortion in order to increase population. These laws remained until today. Of course, they were defended and upheld by local religious or political leaders, but I think a historical reading of why we've got here is very important. This, again, does not also, should not prevent us from looking at the more recent developments with neoliberalism and the role of IFIs, national financial institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF, and pushing for austerity measures in the region, and what this means for women, specifically in terms of access to reproductive health services, but also in terms of access to many of their basic needs and services in the region. So I'll stop here, and we can come back to the discussion on the role of violence and armed conflict on women, or the effects.
Thank you so much, Rima. And I found your blog and your writing, as well as the guide that Nella wrote, incredibly informative in specifically making these links, which we feel them, we see them, but sometimes we find it takes a lot of guidance and practice to identify these linkages. And so thank you so much for helping us doing that. And Resha, I've learned so much of the work and research you do at Peace Track Initiative on peace building in Yemen and on fostering the grassroots movement. Would you like to share with us some of your observations on gender dynamics and women contribution to a feminist political economy approach at the grassroots level in Yemen?
Okay, thank you very much, Leila. I would like to thank people who joined us, and I would like to thank WILPF for organizing such an event of such a crucial topic, which is really seldom talked about. I'm going to speak from my work experience more on the grassroots level, and I will speak now about the agriculture sector and also militarization and its role on affecting the participation of women in public life. So Yemen's domestic economy is largely dependent on oil, which counts for about 90% of export earnings and about 75% of government revenues. Agricultural exports come second, and it is the main source of employment for about 40% of the population. However, it is very much neglected as a sector. So Yemen population remains predominantly rural. Rural communities rely heavily on women agriculture and livestock, and women provide about 60% of labor in crop farming and 90% in livestock rearing, and only 10% of wage labor. And most of the work that women do will be focused on the lower level of picking and doing the agriculture work, while men will be on the machines, on the camels, and in the market. Yet rural women are deprived of many opportunities and rights. They have limited rights to ownership or control assets, and their participation in social and political life is restricted. And although Yemeni agriculture sector has been described as the most important economic sector for the purpose of combating poverty, and that's even before the war, and promoting the employment of Yemen's rural areas. It's also for food security. However, current international planning for post-war recovery seems to prioritize mostly the political reforms and completely ignore this sector. According to World Food Programme, despite the ongoing humanitarian assistance, 16 million Yemenis are food insecure, and out of which 5 million are acutely food insecure. And there are areas of famine-like that started to come back again since 2 years ago to areas like Hajja, Amran, and Jawf, which is located near the capital city, Sana'a. And these areas are predominantly rural and agricultural areas. The International Labour Organization also found that the internal displacement due to the conflict caused the agriculture sector to lose nearly 50% of its workforce as IDPs. Also, the Saudi-led coalition launched more than 50% of its airstrikes on the agricultural land. Houthis also have planted mines on these areas, which prevented farmers and fishermen from securing their livelihoods. So now I'm going to talk about just militarization and how it affected women, because arms trade is also flourishing, and arms trade is another economy that is focused on, unfortunately, more. So Yemen has always been a militarized nation, and even before this current war, 60% of households owned private firearms, and Yemen ranked in the top 10 in the world of countries who privately owned firearms at home. The military camps and depots were still and are still positioned in highly populated cities and areas. As women, we have continuously sounded and alarmed and called for demilitarization of cities. However, there were never serious efforts to implement and disarm and demilitarize programs. Weapons are simply sold on Facebook. Schools are being transformed into military locations and used by armed groups. And 7 years now with war, we only have been seeing escalation and armed conflicts everywhere. And militarization has been creeping into areas that have been previously safer. Armed groups such as Houthis militias have not been more powerful than today, so they're the most powerful now. And the impact of this increased masculine militarization is catastrophic, especially on women. The violations and abuses against women in Yemen have reached a gravity level that we have not witnessed before in history. Women are killed at homes, in markets, schools, in hospitals. The tribal values that we had that considered targeting women as a big shame are no longer respected, unfortunately. And then I will discuss with you later on more topics regarding the effect on women on a grassroots level. Thank you, Leila.
Thank you so much, Rasha. And what harrowing numbers. I think we can link these numbers to most conflict countries we work in, on the percentages of women doing the informal work, on them having to carry single-handedly a lot of almost all of the unpaid work, and what would that mean to their lives. And thank you also for bringing militarization. WILPF has done a lot of research on the gendered impact of increased militarization. Just one number that I keep quoting because it mortifies me is the presence of a small arm in the household increases the chances of domestic violence turning into femicide by 500%. These are lives of almost always women who are being sacrificed, so the armed trade continues. On that note, I'd like us to move this conversation into some of the aspects that we see regularly in our region on humanitarian aid and on conflict recovery and reconstruction. These issues have been very central to discussions about peace building in the recent years. The capitalist neoliberal policies have not only reflected in how conflicts are initiated and fueled and how they impact people, but also in the global efforts to remedy the humanitarian impact, as well as how we look at accountability, reconstruction, and at recovery. And I'm going to start where Rima mentioned about a colonial thinking, not only in our laws, but also very much in the response to the humanitarian needs. It's inherently colonial, and it seems it seems never ending. So I'll start with a question to you, Rima. You said in your blog that a gendered approach is not enough to understand and address the major humanitarian crisis created by conflict in our region, and that we need to apply a feminist lens. Could you please tell us what would that mean in practice?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Leila. So what I mean is that we need to make those links, right, between a gendered approach that is essentially a feminist approach. So beyond just the breakdown of the numbers, but also an approach that is more politically holistic and that looks at the implications. And also that looks at society with all the different categories. So what does it mean for women, but also what does it mean for queer people? What does it mean for children? In this sense, the gendered relationships are about relationships of power in society. Now, thinking more closely about this question of the armed conflict and militarization and post-war settings, and also the humanitarian sector, there's a lot that can be said, again, by looking at the numbers, but also what it means in our everyday reality. So if we just look at the arms trade in the region, the numbers are quite alarming. So I'll just give you a few figures because as we will see, I mean, it's the same countries and the same imperialist powers that are the ones who actually sell arms. So they are the reason. I mean, why is this region in the world having, being the least peaceful region? Where is this arm coming from, and to whose benefit? So when we look at the numbers, it's the same countries that are selling arms, and it's also, these are the same countries that are the biggest donors for the humanitarian sector, right? So what does it really say about this planet we all live on? So the top 5 arms suppliers to the Middle East are, so 48%, almost half of the arms or the arms supply in the region comes from the US, 17% from Russia, 10% from France, and 5% from each the UK and Germany. This is if we look at the arms supply in the region. Now, if we look at what it means for those countries, why is it so crucial to look at the political economy of arms trade? We figure out that actually 57% of the total arms exports of the UK are to the Middle East. So actually the Middle East is so crucial in terms of arms revenue to a country like the UK. 54% for France, 53% of revenues from arms deals in the US comes from the Middle East. So we see that these are really very alarming numbers. 33% for Russia and 33% for Germany. So although data is scarce and not available for other countries that we know also have a role in conflict in the region, such as Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and China, but we already know, again, and this is from a more ethnographic observation than macro data, we know that there are supplies of arms from these countries. And this has huge implication on the lives of women and men and others in society for several reasons. One, when arms are so widespread in society, automatically we see higher rates of gender-based violence and domestic violence. There's a culture of toxic masculinity that becomes more prevalent. The approach of thinking about war as or war victims as being mainly men who are in the trenches has changed after the First World War. And today, the approach is more to look at victims of wars as being mainly the civilians, and therefore women and children predominantly. It doesn't, and men of course, but mainly. The indirect implications of war and the context of like Syria and countries where the dictatorship is still alive, unfortunately, is that women in many cases are becoming victims because of the political activism of a male relative, or because of their own political activism. but also women who have lost their male relatives as who are socially viewed as their main breadwinners or protectors are suffering from social stigma that prevents them in many cases from becoming financially independent, finding a job or living alone, etc. So many women are being pushed into making decisions that are not really decisions that they want, such as either early marriage or a forced second marriage, or they're being pushed into dangerous industries like human trafficking, or many women have resorted to industries that are exploitative for them, such as prostitution, but also, maybe domestic work in many cases can also be very exploitative. I mean, paid domestic labor. So war has huge implications on the lives of women in their everyday lives. There's also another issue that we can dwell on more if you want in the Q&A, the question of women and wars are not just victims. We have seen, for example, in Rojava, and there has been a lot of hype around the women fighters and women activists in the region and revolutionary. Of course, as I said at the start of my intervention, women have been at the forefront. So they're not just passive, recipients in the region, but they are also active. And therefore, thinking about what war or what participation of women in armed conflict means from a feminist perspective, I think is a complex question that needs unpacking. On the other hand, as I said, there's the response to the war context is a humanitarian sector that has boomed in the past decade, and that brings with it or reproduces the same inequalities in many cases, not just but also colonial. So we see, these the several multinational or the several international organizations that have opened in the region new branches. We see the hierarchy in hiring. Local staff are underpaid. Local staff are the ones who are really doing the field work on the ground that is more dangerous, that is more risky, but yet they don't get the same life opportunities in terms of, in terms of their labor rights within the institutions. We also see how when, I did a study last year showing how when the funding started to decrease for example, Syrian refugees in Lebanon, one of the first things that was removed from the aid packages they received were pads. So women menstrual hygiene management is, for example, not prioritized. And we see how, anything related to women's health, women hygiene is not a priority, and it's very easy to remove from the packages offered. So again, under this bigger, the bigger discussion about, all these organizations mainstreaming gender and a gendered approach, there's really a feminist approach that is missing. So we can go on for hours about what this means, but it's clearly one has to go back and look at, the colonial history, neoliberalism and what it means, and a war context that is, all three having very real implications on the lives of women in the region, and implications that require, I think, very urgent and mobilization.
Thank you so much, Rima. It saddens me to just remember that half of the countries, the exporting countries you mentioned, are signatories and have ratified the Arms Trade Treaty, which a lot of colleagues and feminist activists have worked on for so many years to for it to have any value and for it to actually contribute to limiting the damage of armed trade, but clearly to no avail. So thank you for mentioning all of that. I'm going to move to Resha, and Resha, from your experience and your observations, could you take us through the impacts of this neoliberal humanitarian interventions that lack a feminist lens, and what have their impact on being in Yemen, and how did local grassroots women group fight that impact?
Okay, thank you, Leila. The humanitarian aid, Yemen has been receiving humanitarian aid even before the war. And it has the capacity of hurt the economic recovery as much as it helps. For example, over-reliance on aid and expense of economic recovery and development may worsen the conflict and prolong the recovery. So to rebuild Yemen, the look at the economy should change, and we should make sure that we work on both sides, which is working on the economy besides the humanitarian intervention. Unfortunately, in Yemen, the areas were always under the like the worst situation, humanitarian situation has been exacerbated after the war, and they are the most areas that fighters come from, and they are unfortunately agricultural areas, which things could have been sorted differently if the sector was supported either by the government or the state before the war, and also international decisions regarding what Yemen needs. I mean, I will open a can of worms here, but Yemen is not labeled by the UN as a war or a civil war. It's labeled as humanitarian crisis, the worst humanitarian crisis. And that's what we hear. And that means the obligations that the international community has towards Yemen falls into only the humanitarian sector. And then we hear a song, it's like a song we hear all the time from both national, local, and international community, which is Yemen, women will come later on, but now we need to stop the conflict so that we can help providing humanitarian needs, intervention. And I don't know until when Yemen will be still kept in this victim needing humanitarian help before until now, and it's getting worse, but still we are labeled into that, which leads to nothing. Before the conflict also, around half of the population were already living under the poverty level, about $1.50 per day. And the number of people living under poverty has increased now with the war because of the cut of salaries to civil servants and the loss of income and livelihood opportunities. Many people are not even able to afford food. Early marriage has increased. It was about 40% before the war, and now it's only God knows, it's above 70%, since the families resort to marry off their daughters as a means to make income from dowries. Poverty and hunger has also been a powerful contributor to the increase of child recruitment.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Resha, for sharing these with us. And we know of a lot of work that has been done by PTI and other organizations and grassroots groups to try to counter that. And unfortunately, very little light gets shed on it in the bigger sphere of the humanitarian operation, or what's called so in Yemen. So thank you for enlightening us on that level. I'm gonna take a question for Nella about the effects of the neoliberal policies when made part of the post-conflict rebuilding and recovery.
Yes. Yeah. Well, when we move from conflict to peace, although it's not really a linear process, as we know, it goes back and forth, and I'm not really sure whether we ever really end up in a post-conflict period. But trying to move from conflict to peace, the economic policies that are advocated by the international financial institutions, but not just by them. I mean, there are all these geopolitical players that make claims on our countries, as well as our own domestic capitalist elite. They don't really abandon the neoliberal agenda just because they are faced with this, recovery from war and poverty and everything that we just heard. What is happening with a country when it goes through conflict and war. They do still build and upfront their ideas of what sort of recovery for conflict looks like on the idea of growth and sort of this measurement in GDP and how that is a sign that we are recovering. There's also this assumption that sort of the best environment for peace is built through and by the free market. It's very clear when you read the documents of the World Bank in particular. It's very clearly there. So environment is best built through the free market. So when we talk about, the effects of the neoliberal policies and the post-conflict recovery processes, this growth imperative and the reliance on the market is really important to understand and to unpack. So what does it mean, when we say free market? What does that mean at all? Well, usually freeing the market, if we look at their policies, it means basically deregulating, for example, the labor market by, for example, removing laws that protect the workers, but it can also mean opening up the spaces that usually were within the public domain, like healthcare, to private actors. So either through outright privatization or through public-private partnerships, which is also a form of privatization and hugely popular now these days. Deregulating and freeing the market can also mean removal of existing or blocking of attempts to introduce environmental protection laws or other laws that will be beneficial for the environment. So the assumption is that by deregulating the market and opening the space for lucrative investments, the country will attract investors, preferably foreign investors, and more capital investments will lead to economic growth. So foreign investments also mean access to foreign currency, which is really important for the big international financial institutions, because having foreign currency means that the countries will be able to repay the debt of the credits that they've been pumping into the countries trying to recover. So there's really ulterior motives here in the background. So, some of the people in our countries recovering from war will benefit from this for sure, but the majority will not. In my country, for example, the only people that benefited from this approach and these types of economic policies was the political elite, the ethno-national political elite that led us into war, that then benefited during the war and now benefits from the supposed peace. And these assumptions really do underlie most of the economic policies, and they are automatically almost rolled out in countries recovering from conflict. So top of the agendas are privatization, deregulations, and reforms of taxes and wages. This is also an important part. And these reforms basically drain the public budgets. Less money in the public budgets means less money available for investments in social infrastructure. And I cannot overemphasize the importance of the public sector and social infrastructure for people recovering from conflict, in particular women. Because, on the one hand, public sector, primarily healthcare and education, but also other public institutions are known as one of the biggest employers of women. At the same time as the public sector, if adequately planned and financed, helps create an environment that enables women to enter public spaces. Like, finding an employment for women is heavily dependent on access to institutionalized childcare support. The ability of women to be politically active, we always ask for political participation of women, but that also requires that there is a support network that can take over some of the burdens that women do. For women to even seek justice, to go to courts and testify on the war crimes she or somebody, she's witness to or be subjected to, this requires a system of support that cannot be determined by sort of profit-driven agenda. And if we look at, the estimates related to Syria in terms of reconstruction needs, we are really talking about billions of dollars in losses, on top of which are the housing sector, industrial sector, services, and public services. So we're talking about millions and millions of Syrians requiring healthcare, requiring infrastructure for water and sanitation, requiring access to food, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, there's very little room here to think about how these needs can be addressed in a way that brings in profit. I think what we're talking about is meeting the needs of the people so that some years down the road, they are healthy, they are safe, they are recovered as much as it's possible to recover from a conflict, so that they can participate in the economy in a way that means that they also have an agency and are not just a resource for that economy.
Thank you, Lala. I know I echo a lot of our partners and women activists in the region to absolutely relate to everything you're saying, and also thinking, where do I start? What are the priorities? How do we take that forward in the very little resources available to us? So any suggestions?
Oh, well, I mean, it's like big issues we tackle, but they still need to be tackled. And I think obviously each context is different, but in our differences, I think it's possible to predict some similarities, which if we cannot tackle all the different issues that have been raised earlier in the seminar, there are some issues that it's my opinion, but I think when we look at the conflict, some issues tend to me to be priority, not just in terms of, you know, investing in it, but in us understanding what is the proper investment, how does it look like. So for example, you know, I cannot talk enough about healthcare. You know, when we look at the countries coming out of conflict, there will be some very specific immediate needs for healthcare that we can foresee, and we need healthcare to be accessible and affordable, and not just available for those that can afford it. So we need to look at how would investments in healthcare in that given context look like, and how it would look like so that it is available for everybody who needs it. And we can also understand from this that, you know, for a public healthcare sector to function, it needs to be built upon a well-resourced public sector that can help deliver that healthcare sector. And I mean, like Dima was mentioning earlier, you know, public sector and good healthcare is of course needed elsewhere. But for me, it seems almost like a matter of life and death, because people are facing such a high levels of trauma. And if there is no affordable healthcare for them to overcome, the care will fall on women. This is why I'm really reiterating the need to, if we cannot focus on all the segments, we really need to look at this one. Because it will fall on women. It will triple their burden, because they too have their own traumas, right? But they will ignore them to care for others. This is what will happen. You know, people, you know, that don't receive proper treatment will carry these traumas into segments we don't even think is related. And again, I'm speaking from a Bosnian experience, but we're like 25 years into this post-conflict recovery period. And we are seeing this trauma, when it's not treated properly, really emerging in segments that we couldn't even possibly imagine were related to war, you know. So again, healthcare is the basis here, and we need to understand what's the proper investment into healthcare. It needs to be provided systematically and adequately. And I want to also say that it cannot really be left up to the NGOs to carry that burden forward. You know, many NGOs provide health and other types of support during conflicts and war, because, you know, the state is missing, we're filling the gaps. But post-war recovery really needs this to be brought back into the public sector. Another very obvious example that we need to be on top of and understand is our reparations. That's an obvious one. This needs to happen ASAP, and the reparations need to be planned according to a very rigorous gender analysis, and they have to be comprehensive, because, you know, it's not just the individuals that are recovering from conflict, it's a social trauma. The social fabric is torn apart. So while we understand how we can repair individuals, we also need to understand what it would look like to repair the society. What sort of, is there a nexus between social and economic rights, the access to social and economic rights in general, and reparations in particular, and how do we address that nexus? And obviously, I mean, the list of what needs to be prioritized is very long, so I'm not going to go through, you know, not even try to cover it all, but I want to mention informal sector again. Dima was talking about the high level of, you know, presence of women within the informal sector. Conflicts tend to make that worse, but the current mainstream approach is not so much about, you know, investing in the informal sector in order to bring these people into the formal economy. To me, it's almost, when you read the mainstream analysis of the international financial institutions, it's like they want to punish these people, you know. And I saw a comment that we received through an email from Iraq, which says that a lot of these people in the informal economy, they are there because they cannot afford to make their businesses legit. The taxes are so high. So we need to look at, you know, why women are in the informal economy, what are the added challenges them being in the informal economy will bring. For example, a lot of these women and other marginalized people that are forced to be part of the informal economy will not have a retirement. Probably most of them don't have healthcare. So there are different challenges that I think definitely need to be looked at. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nella, and thank you for bringing reparation to this. WILPF works in Syria with Syrian partners, but also across the region on a feminist, gender-sensitive, feminist, and also victim-centered approach to transitional justice. And we can definitely see this link between reparations as a concept, both on the individual and on the collective level, and the social and economic rights of victims and of everyone in the community, and how it's almost impossible to achieve any level of holistic feminist solution without taking that into consideration. So thanks for bringing that up. I'll encourage everyone who's listening to us to post questions on the question and answer option. If you're watching on live stream on social media, do post them on a comment, and we'll import them here for our speakers to address at the last 20 minutes. And I'm gonna move now from trying to turn all of the great depth that you have shared with us into actions and opportunities, and try to understand how to do that in the real life situations that our partners and that grassroots organizations in the region are facing. So I'm going to pose a question for all panelists on what are the concrete actions needed, and how to, you're telling us to redirect the money. How do we do that? How do we, as grassroots activists and as international organizations, from the spaces available to us, to that? How do we influence the policies? If you rightly raised at the beginning that the local communities are almost never asked as these policies are being developed. What are the feminist alternatives and how do we impose them? So would love to hear your thoughts about this. Rima, would you like to start?
Sure. It's a difficult question because, you know, what we really wish for is beyond just a few action plans, action points. You know, it's more of a structural change. But I think, and maybe I want to talk a bit more about one context that we haven't talked about today, which is the context of occupation. Right? I mean, sometimes it's about redirecting the money, but sometimes it's also about how do we lobby and how do we make sure. So, I mean, the region, if we look at the political setup, we have countries that are still living under authoritarian regimes. We have settler colonialism. We have kleptocratic or mafia regimes, such as in Lebanon or Iraq. So, and specifically, I mean, the Palestinian context. I mean, so. What we can do is, I think, while it's difficult to tell because there's so much change that we need, but I think that we still should, and it's our responsibility to try to think together of what are some of the action points we can put forth. So I would divide them into 3 or 4 categories. I would say the first one is, I'm thinking about political or war, post-war settings. It's very important to, as I said, you know, shed light on. So once we understand better the political economy of arms deals, for example, it becomes easier for us to lobby and mobilize against, you know, certain deals or against the way things are being done. And that sector, I think the work of investigative journalism or researchers or activists on the ground is really important. So supporting those initiatives, and again, so sometimes indirectly by supporting journalists, we are actually, you know, supporting more of a feminist political economy approach, because we need to understand better the dynamics of how this, you know, neoliberal capitalist system is working, and what are the imperial colonial agendas behind it. So I think this is very important, but also here at the political level, there's also a call for feminist solidarity across borders. You know, so as I said, the numbers are, I mean, countries in the West are the ones benefiting from those armed trades. So lobbying, especially taxpayers in countries where, you know, people can have a say or can lobby against certain, you know, certain governmental decisions, and creating those connections and creating a transnational feminist movement, you know, sometimes doing things in the UK will definitely help women in the region. The other point, or the other level where I think it's very, very crucial for us to mobilize is labor. Whether it is in terms of labor organization, so unions, associations, you know, from a feminist perspective, you know, and thinking about this in a way that fits the current realities. So organizing the unemployed, organizing the informal sector, but also, thinking in terms of labor. So it doesn't just have to be those sectors, but also organizing within international organizations, right? And people who work in a country like Lebanon, and I think in Palestine as well, the aid sector or the humanitarian sector is the biggest employer. And people and national staff, people who work in those sectors often think of themselves as doing charity and or are approached as such, right? And what I'm calling for here is for these people to see themselves as workers as well, right? And this would kind of break this divide within international organizations and the humanitarian sector, where there's an approach that is often, moral rather than one that is linked to labor. Because there's a lot of exploitation that goes into labor in those organizations, and because these are some of the main employers in the region, because there's lack of employment and lack of a productive sector. The third area, I think, is social legal change. So there are huge, very deep transformations that are happening in the region at the level of the structure of the family, the gender role that is changing with, with the high number of refugees. We are already seeing lots of reports, but also, realities on the ground about how role of women within the families are changing, how sometimes it's easier for women to go out and work because there's a lot of hostility against men, or racism in some contexts against men. So these are huge changes that are happening, and I think these need to be pushed or coupled with campaigns for legal change and also social change in terms of culture that is until today is still very much masculine and patriarchal. The last point, the last sphere where I think is very important for us to think of action plans is linking the question of feminist political economy with environment, especially in our region. What it means for women in the region to fight the environmental fights is crucial. We can see this through some of the campaigns around, for example, dams, such as the Bisri Dam in Lebanon that was finally was stopped, but that was a project supported by the World Bank, and that was going to affect the lives and livelihoods of a lot of region, but and mainly women also, especially in a context where, and here we're talking also about women in rural areas, women who work in agriculture. So we, beyond just to focus on women in urban areas of the region, it's important for us to couple environmental activism with the feminist activism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rima. Resha.
I really like what Rima said. She covered the things that basically, as she said, restructuring everything from scratch. The topic of environment and women agriculture, I think it's something that we need to talk about further in the future, and climate change. So I would think from the context of Yemen, I'm just going to give you 2 points that are more practical for now, while it's just, like an urgent step to start working on that aspect. So I think women meaningful and equal participation is a basic urgent need that we need in Yemen right now. So in Yemen, for example, so there is like a lack of international pressure on the from the UN Envoy Office on the political parties or warring parties, negotiation parties, and peace parties. They're everything. So there's like a lack of pressure from the international community on them to include women, which gave them the excuse to completely ignore them, which was reflected in the recent formation of the government that was announced recently that had 0 women, which is a historical flow that the historical fail that we have now in Yemen. Women exclusion was really a big shock for us, and although we had a successful model in 2012-13 national dialogue outcomes, where we had some of the outcomes was to have 30% participation of women in all aspects. But then again, they say, where are the women? Although women are, as Rima mentioned also, that they are on the front line. They are the ones who have been combating COVID. They are the ones who are mediating between tribes in the conflicts and local tribes. They are the ones who have been like filling gaps, doing these nurturing jobs, even before the war, doing things and services that previous regime failed to address, that people actually need. However, whenever there is peace negotiations or tables or participation of women, they ask this famous question, where are the women? So women have to be there. The other thing is, I'll go back to the agriculture sector. And so I surveyed 254 women working in the agriculture sector, specifically in the coffee agriculture sector, because coffee was the #1 export crop in Yemen, and it's the one that brings dollars. So it's the first example that you can look into how men would be controlling it and how women are more likely to have no say in it and be working for free informally. So the things I asked them about is what are the things, the challenges they face, and what are the things that they would like to see changing. So the overwhelming majority of the women indicated that they had not received any training. 90% of them identified themselves as farmers or field work. Some of them commented that they are frustrating because they really wanted to attend any trainings, and that the training is only for men, and that men really do not allow them to do this, although they are the ones working in the farm. They also mentioned that they would like to access the market. They don't know who sells their coffee, where does it go after they pick it and they dry it. And it is not uncommon in rural Yemeni communities that there is this lack of training, which means there is lack of basically implementation and lack of participation and empowerment of women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rasha. And can I use this opportunity to salute the amazing efforts by PTI and other Yemeni organizations and the Women's Solidarity Network in Yemen on campaigning since the beginning of the humanitarian crisis and conflict for women participation, and the indefatigable efforts recently about women participation in the government. The campaign has been absolutely fascinating, and I know for a fact it will bear fruit despite all the circumstances around it. So thank you so much for bringing this. Nella?
Sorry. Yes, sorry. Yeah, well, a lot has been covered, so not much to add here, but there I think 2 or 3 points I might be able to add to the great conversation. Obviously, I mean, it's very difficult to talk about where the space is. I mean, we work in such a diverse context, and that space is also so contextualized, and sometimes it's super dangerous, and it's not always that space is open for us, but there are some bits and pieces where we can potentially enter. And I think, for example, donors are one. Rima and Asha have already talked about it, and the neo-colonial sort of agendas the donors come with, and we've felt it for 25 years in Bosnia. But I've also come to understand that donors are potentially the one group that's easiest to approach. It's not that they have been listening so much thus far, but if we're looking for space to try to push our analysis forward, it's not impossible to access donors or embassies, etc., and try to, sort of engage them in a discussion of why their policies are usually really not really well thought through and might have completely reverse effect. So that's one space where I think we should be more bold in engaging. So not just when we come to them to discuss projects, but come to them with political agendas. This is where we want our societies to move forward. Also engaging with international financial institutions. I mean, I find that sometimes to be difficult in some spaces, and sometimes it's it's easier. Like, for example, in Bosnia, we don't have any capacities among the civil society to engage, nor has there been interest thus far to engage with international financial institutions, but there are other contexts where people have tried to engage. For example, in Egypt, I know there is a network trying to engage that space. So it is possible. We need to look into that. There are also international organizations whose mandates are specifically into sort of monitoring and working towards international financial institutions, such as the Bretton Woods Project. But what I sort of often think is that they are lacking conflict perspectives. So we might want to look how we can merge these spaces. So I think that's the two sort of added things to the conversation. And just towards the end, I do want to a little bit demystify the concept of feminist political economy analysis. I still think it sounds, even if we did our best, I think, to really say it's common sense. It really is common sense. Sometimes I do think it sounds a little bit grand, as if you're expected to do difficult reports with diagrams, and you need money and resources to do it. But I actually think, when we look at feminist political economy analysis, what we are doing is that we are telling a story. And we are telling a story from a political, economic, and social perspectives. And when we're doing it, we're not simply sort of adding women to it, we are centering them in our story. And as feminists, there is nobody better place to do that than feminists, because we tend to have a very broad network of women we already work and cooperate with. We've already collected so much information. We might need it to structure it differently. We might need to investigate a little bit more, but we have a really good basis for doing it. And sort of, despite the popular belief that women, the feminists only work with women's organizations, we do actually have access to great sort of networks that work against injustices and inequalities. So we are really well placed, and we're telling a story. That's what it is about. And it's not complicated. We don't need massive resources. We just need to dig into the field. We need to understand it. And then we need to sort of find the spaces. Sometimes they're small, sometimes they're big, to advocate for it.
Thank you so much, Nella. What a great note to end this fantastic conversation on, about telling the story, and a great homework you've given to our donors. So I know there's a few of them with us here, and a few who are going to watch this. So that's a homework for you, to include the story as it is in the way you try to understand that aspect. And for governmental donors, and extra homework to have a shout across the hall to those who are setting policies in capitals in the global north, which is impacting the stories in conflict and post-conflict countries, and how to do that differently. I'm not even going to start trying to sum this up, because everything you said has been absolutely fascinating, but we'll try to, the session will be available online, and will be streamed, and will be on YouTube for those who couldn't see it. We do have a few questions that I'm going to read to you, and feel free, the questions were not addressed at a specific speaker, so do feel free to pick them as you wish. The first one is a comment from one of our partners in Iraq, who said, it's very important to have a real policy for supporting women. Women-headed households have issues entering the market, so they're better able to enter the market. In Iraq, it's difficult because of the admission requirement. She gave us an excellent example that one of the conditions is to have a government employee sponsor with a salary of more than 1 million Iraqi dinars to get a loan for starting a project, for example. So that's just one example, and we know exactly who are the people who have high salaries in governmental positions, and what would that mean in creating and reaffirming structural hierarchies of power. Also, she raised a very important point on the need to have a strong policy on harassment and sexual abuse, especially in male members of the family, and how to look at the denial of income, of women's income. So when they are no longer able to control their own income in the family where harassment is prevailing. And she finally raised the issue of international organizations, and how they have sometimes the same problem as as UN agencies who are trying to have introduce official licenses, official and high rate of taxes, which became impossible for women to access such opportunities. So all of these are issues who you have raised, and is giving us an excellent example from Iraq to emphasize. We also have 3 questions, but we do have a few minutes if anybody wants to add questions to the question and answer session or on the live streaming. And the first one is a request to send a link about the arms supply data. And I think this is a question to Rima. So if that's okay.
There's a link in the article, in the blog, so it's there.
Great. So the blog, which is shared here and will be shared with all those who attended or could not attend, will have a link to all these information. I also encourage you to look at our recent publication on Women, Peace and Security Agenda +20 in the MENA. There's a section on militarization and armament with some information that could be helpful on this domain. We have 2 questions by Sofia Antonelli from SFJN. The first one is, what's the place reserved for international institutions like the UN in the application of feminist economic policies? And the second question is it worth it for CSOs, for civil society organizations, to reach out to such structures, insisting a shift on their approach, or is it just better to focus on more I think she means community-based solutions. So I'll post these, they're not addressed at a particular panelist, so I'll post these for all of you to answer. So one on the UN and what's their role, and on civil society organization and whether it's worth changing the structure or focusing on the community level.
I can try. I think answering Sophia, I think it's both. You know, there are lots of skepticism about the role of the UN, and you know, whether it would really go a structural change, or whether it always plays this role of you know, in between governments and the grassroots. But I think, you know, as we said, it's what we want is to bring down the patriarchy and capitalism. What we can do on the way there is, you know, if we see political opportunities, whether within or with the UN or grassroots organizations, I think we should try both. But you know, I also think that, you know, there is a link between international organizations and grassroots organizations, and the whole literature about NGOization, the implication of funding on grassroots initiatives, etc. So they're not really separate, and this is why I think both should be tackled together. The comments on Iraq are great, actually, but I mean, one thing we did not really talk about, and that might be, and maybe I misunderstood the first question, but if this is about, you know, this microfinance or, you know, the encouraging women to become entrepreneurs, I think we should also be very careful with that, because we know from other experiences how, you know, how this, again, neoliberal approach to you become your own boss, and that you don't need to be, you know, because with employment comes job security, comes pension. So when you are, you know, the owner of your own business, we have seen how it's mainly women in Asia who have suffered from these plans that were devised, you know, the microfinance approach. And, you know, we should be careful in the region, Iraq and other places, not to, you know, not to go down that track, because it will eventually be very harmful for women themselves on the longer run.
Laila, can I just jump in? Because I think that's really great point, Rima. Really, and I think there is a connection maybe with the question about the UN, because I've been thinking, what are these sort of economic policies that UN is driving that would be worth really engaging with. And I think exactly the economic empowerment of women projects, which really do what you were just saying. And I think it's a systematic approach rather than an approach in individual countries. So I think if we are looking for what would be interesting subjects to engage or what would be worthwhile engaging with UN, obviously for, there are many others, but I would really single out the economic empowerment of women projects, because I find them at the core to be very neoliberal, exactly what Rima was saying, turning, understanding economic empowerment of women as by turning them into entrepreneurs. And we are living in a very unforgiving free market world. And it's really difficult for women with their knitting projects and the homemade cheese and whatever they can make in their little, sort of to compete in that market. So I would really like to see both international organizations and local NGOs and everybody who can engaging with UN, specifically UN Women, I think, who are usually are behind these projects, engaging them in a conversation. Is this really the best we can do for women in a post-conflict situation?
Can I add something, Leila?
Please.
So I just want to add 2 points to what Nela and Rima said. Yes, economic empowerment for women is important, but it's, again, not being entrepreneurs, rather than looking from a context of Yemen, looking into the laws that inhibit women from owning what they should own, and the value chain in, like, for example, agriculture sector, and how much value people are putting and how much money they get out of this value they're putting into that value chain. Legal rights of access to, like, health and education, all these kind of things that will support women economically, basically, more than forcing them into just becoming entrepreneurs. The other point, when it comes to the UN, and from my experience in Yemen, the issue is that with international community in general, when they support, let's say, women, when they support local organizations, they tend to many of them tend to have very difficult criteria that women organizations don't meet, which could be a high budget that mostly male organizations or old, maybe related to regimes or other strong political parties or tribes would have. And also they would require, they would look at women as victims and that we need to help, rather than what do they have to add. So yeah, thank you.
Spot on. Thank you so much for these absolutely correct comments, and we can relate to them in our day-to-day work every day, and I know a lot of those who are watching can. I think these are all our questions, and that's great because we're 2:28, so it doesn't get any better in times of time. But I want to just take this opportunity to thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and analysis with us, and for all the guidance and food for thought through this panel. And I'd also like to thank all our attendees who made this very interesting and who shared their time with us. We have a small survey just so we can gather from those who are attending and also from those who couldn't attend, how can we build on this? So it's in just 2 small questions of anything else on this subject that could be helpful. And any ideas, whether public or private, we'd be very happy to. We cannot promise to fulfill every one of them, but we'll certainly do our best. So we will put the survey here on the chat for everyone, and we'll also send it by email to everyone. And thank you all so much. And thanks to our panelists, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you, Leila, and thank you, everyone.
Well done, everyone. That was great. Thank you.